Hey guys, Molten here. Welcome back to this video on one of the most important aspects of chess, which is how to improve your calculation. So I'll teach you step by step how I do it during my games, so you can take some tips from there. Also, I'll walk you through 6 different examples ranging from basic, intermediate to more advanced and master level positions, so you can see how the thought process evolves over time. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you straight after this intro. So when it comes down to calculation, there are essentially 2 main methods which most people will use. In the majority of cases, using the first method alone, you'll be able to work out the most optimal move in most positions. But in cases where you have a more complex position, then you might have to include the second method as well. So the first method I'll call the quick scan method, and this starts out by first determining your opponent's threat. So simply look at their last move and try to determine what idea they have in mind. So once you work out their idea, you can look for ways that you can try to stop it perhaps. So then we go on to step 2, which is to look for force tactics. So there are differences between force tactics and non-force tactics. Here we're looking for mainly checks, captures, and threats in the position. So we start usually in that order, and we keep looking until we reach a conclusion. So once we can no longer see any more forcing moves, that's usually when we end our calculation, and then we make a evaluation of the position. So when we're evaluating position, you want to be looking at key features in the position. You also want to be looking at mainly material imbalances, but also things such as pawn structure imbalances, weaknesses, quality of pieces. It can be many different things. You may even take into consideration not just the objective assessment of the position, but also the practical assessment of the position, which is something people often don't take into consideration. So that's it for method number 1, but sometimes you get more complex positions or positions where there's no obvious tactics right away, and then you might need to use what we call deep calculation. So for this one, some people just skip straight to step 2, but I like to first determine what type of position it is. I put it into 2 categories normally. Is it a doing position or is it a being position? So typically doing positions I define as ones where it's quite dynamic, there's lots of tactical possibilities, and something where you don't have much time, you have to make a decision. Whereas being positions, you do have a lot of time, maybe the position is quite closed, and it tends to lead to more strategic and maneuvering, where the thinking is based in plans rather than raw calculation on its own. I also like to determine whether the position is a critical position or not, but that's just for me. Critical position being ones where you're changing the position, either there's lots of tactics you need to consider, or ones where you're really changing the pawn structure in some way. Typically, I don't like to make these sort of big pawn structure decisions when you're low on time, or in longer time control games, if you're reaching near move 40, then you also tend to not want to make these type of decisions in those situations. Okay, step 2 is breaking down candidate moves. So we pick out the moves which look quite plausible, and we analyze them one by one. If you analyze your candidate moves and you find that none of them really work, then you might need to go back to the start and look for a different candidate move. If you see that a variation is working quite well and the end result is quite good, then you may want to keep that candidate move as a backup reserve while you check the other ones. Also check different move orders, because that's very important. Often people miss up on the move orders while they're doing this step. And the last step is again evaluation. And this is very, very important, especially when it comes to deep calculation, because it requires you to be very good with your visualization. But the moves are quite deep into the analysis, so you want to be really good with this aspect. And often a lot of people may get the calculation right, but they misevaluate the final position, and that leads to them not playing the move which may have won them the game. So you definitely want to get good at this aspect of the game. So without further ado, I'll jump into a few examples just so you can see how it works out. So the best thing to do when you first start out as a beginner is to develop your pattern recognition by practicing a lot of tactics and mating patterns. So for this one, we have a mating pattern, which if you've done it before, then it should come to you instantly. But for each of these ones, I'll also allow you some time to pause the video and work it out for yourself. Okay, so in this position here, we have a mating pattern, which if you've seen it before, it will come quite naturally, and that is to play the move rook to f8 check. We see black does have this threat of rook takes b2, but we check through our various checks and captures as well to see if we have anything in response and whether we need to actually stop that. We did have a few checks with the queen, but they weren't very good, so we check this check we have with the rook. Here we see that black can take it, and we check that do we have any follow-ups after that. Yes, we do. We have a checkmate here on h7. But most of the time, yeah, this comes with pattern recognition, so you don't really have to do much of this consciously over the board. So here again, we have another mating pattern with black, so quickly pause the video if you want to work it out. Otherwise, the solution is rook takes on g2, and we have the move king to h1, and black plays the move rook to g4 check, and after the move rook f3, bishop takes f3 is mate. So next we move on to positions where perhaps you don't recognize any obvious mating pattern, and in these type of positions you need to maybe break down our method one by one a little bit more. But the more tactics you do, the more ideas you will start to pick up on as well. So here, this was a game played by Navarra at the recent Olympiad, and with white to play in this position, pause the video if you want to try and work it out. But in the game, here we can see that black is threatening the pawn, but white has a much better counter threat. If you check through all your different checks and captures, you'll find that white has this queen sacrifice with queen takes h7, and after king takes h7, knight to g5 check, king h7, and pawn to h7 is checkmate. So again, we're checking through all these forcing moves, like our checks and captures, until we reach the very end to see if there's a conclusion at the end. Next position, we have white to move. Okay, so if you came up with the move queen check, then this is correct. So in this position, we can see that the threat is the bishop taking our queen. We can respond to this by taking the bishop, but then if we evaluate the final position, we see that after black moves his rook, we will be down material, and that's probably not good for us. We have two checks here, one on e6 and one on g8. So if we go for the check on e6, we can see that black has a couple of options. He could block the check for one with the queen or with the knight. Probably with the knight, since if he blocks with the queen, we take this knight with a follow-up check, and then we might take the rook. Therefore, he blocks with the knight, and afterwards, there's no checks that we can follow up on. We do have this capture with the rook, but after captures, bishop captures, we don't have anything. But if we go for this check on g8, then the king only has two options. So first you check this option, and then we can see that queen e6 leads to checkmate. And if he goes here, then we have the move queen e6, king to f8, and then knight g6 is checkmate. So again, just following through with your forcing moves. So now we get into more complex situations, and this was a position reached between Aryan Tari and Timur Kubakarov. In this position, Aryan had to make a big decision of whether he wanted to capture this pawn on b2. In fact, it was the only way to save the game, but he had to see one really good move along the way in his calculation, which he ended up missing. So pause the video if you want to work this out. Otherwise, let me show you the solution. So here white can capture this pawn on b2, and here, since they're all forcing moves, it's not so difficult to actually see the moves, but what makes this problem difficult is the visualization. So in this position, after the move queen to g3, king has to go to g1 because otherwise it gets checkmated, and then essentially they're all forcing moves. So queen e3 is really the only check in the position apart from queen e1. After the move king to h2, we have the move rook to f1, which is the only move which generates a threat. Rook check is the only move. King h7, queen c2 is the only check here. King goes to h6. Rook h8 check. King g5, and here white had to see this move at the end, because if he didn't see this move, then this whole combination would not work at all. He had to see the move rook takes h4. Rook h5 looks good. Looks like you're getting some perpetual here, but unfortunately it doesn't work, because after check, queen h6, and there's no more checks after that. So you had to go rook takes h4. The idea being that if black checks here on g1, then king g3 would lead to a perpetual, since there's nothing better for black. However, if black captures, then white has this move queen h7 check. And here, if king to g5, then queen takes pawn, would lead to either perpetual or black losing, because it's getting skewered along the f-file. Therefore queen h6, but then you have this move queen e4 check. And if king g5, you have queen g4 check, followed by another check here on e6. And likewise, if the king stays there and the queen blocks instead on f4, then you need to see this move pawn to g3, which is easy to see here, but quite difficult to see visualizing it from the very beginning. So as you can see, this was a more difficult one, but all the variations were quite forced. So now we reach into a more complex position, which was reached in a game between Gukesh and Sargsyan from the Olympiad. In this position, I was very impressed with Gukesh's ability to evaluate the position correctly and come up with a very, very difficult move for white. So if you want to work it out, pause the video and take some time to work out the best move. Otherwise, in this position, Gukesh came up with this move, king to b1, which is very, very strong move. So in order to come up with a move such as king b1, first he would have had to analyze all the obvious checks and captures and realize there were no tactics which were working in his favor. You can have a look at pawn takes f7 and pawn takes g6 and realize they do not work. He doesn't have any obvious threats either in this position. Then he would have to look a little bit deeper. So what is black's idea? So black's idea on his next move is perhaps to take our pawn on f5 and then take our pawn on e6. This is probably black's idea. Then he would need to come up with ideas on how to improve his pieces or look for potential tactical ideas after that. So he can perhaps improve his bishop by putting it on a square such as b2. So that could have been one idea why he played the move king to b1. He also probably saw that after g takes f5, that there are some positions there after g takes f5 where white can move this bishop away and swing the queen to g2 with some checkmating threats on g8. But a lot of these ideas do not work, because the king being on c1 allows black to play the move bishop takes e3. So he would have to come to this realization and then play the move king to b1 to avoid any possible checks, realizing that he has enough time to play a move like this. Now in the game, after black played g takes f5, which is essentially the only move to relieve some of the pressure, unfortunately it runs into a nasty tactic, which goes bishop takes b4. And after the move queen takes b4, Gukesh plays this move queen to g2, threatening checkmate on g8. And here the only way to avoid the checkmate is to trade queens. And after queen takes e4, he had to analyze queen takes, pawn takes, e7, threatening the rook. Rook to e8, and now he had to have seen this move, rook to g8 check, sacrificing the rook but allowing the pawn to queen. And after the trade of rooks, the queen, we can see that he could have stopped his analysis here, realizing that white has a clear advantage in this position. So as you can see, calculation can be quite easy. It can also get quite difficult as you move on, depending on how complex or how forcing the position is. But I hope it gives you an idea of how to step-by-step think during your games. I hope you enjoyed these positions. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.